listened recently to someone who insisted that the yen and the pound and the euro would all go down before the dollar does. I don't know what the rationale for that is, but that was what many people are saying. In other words, we're the healthiest horse in the glue factory. I think that's what people call us. I think it's misleading, it's delusional, and I think you're right. I think the dollar is in a lot of trouble. It's no longer seen as a real store of value. In fact, I think it was Nassim Taleb who said today gold is effectively the reserve currency.
In recent months, the Middle East has entered a dangerous new phase. This isn't a spontaneous eruption of conflict, but a calculated campaign shaped by Israeli interests and backed by powerful lobbying groups in Washington, London, and New York. Far from representing American priorities, this war serves regional dominance objectives under the guise of Western support. The conflict's roots lie not in defense, but in strategic expansion pursuing control of resources and geopolitical leverage. Meanwhile, US political figures, including Donald Trump, appear to align closely with these goals, raising questions about whose interests are truly being served in this unfolding conflict. History shows that Americans have rarely supported foreign wars unless directly attacked. From World War I to Iraq, intervention often required manipulation or fear. Today, public detachment persists, while policymakers justify ongoing military entanglements as necessary for global stability. The latest fighting mirrors past unfinished wars, such as Desert Storm or Vietnam, which resolved little and set the stage for future chaos. Behind the curtain, elite financial interests and defense industries drive these cycles, leveraging US power for profit and strategic dominance. Until Americans are directly impacted, these wars will likely continue largely unnoticed by a disengaged public.
I don't see any immediate resolution, certainly none in sight. This is a different set of circumstances, though, from what Americans have experienced in the past. This is a wholly Israeli fabricated war. In other words, Israel and its supporters in the United States have fabricated this war with the goal of achieving Israeli supremacy in the region. But more important, I think you're talking about financial hegemony shared by the various billionaire oligarchs that dominate the city of London and New York City and now control Washington. And people are very concerned because this is not the Trump they knew 5-6 years ago. And it's not the Trump they thought they voted for, but they have to go back and rethink some of their assumptions. For those who actually watched the Republican convention, they could not have missed this event that had a giant Israeli flag on the wall, a huge sign that said Israel first, and then this gentleman, whom I do not know and have never seen before or since, walk out onto the stage and try to lead cheers for Israel first. I don't think people really understood what they were seeing, but it was a very clear demonstration of where we were headed as a country if Donald Trump were elected. And ultimately, Donald Trump could never have reached the White House had he not had the support of the Israel lobbies billionaires who were determined to get him into office. So now he's there and he's doing essentially what they want him to do. And that's where we are now. As far as the new long war is concerned, the reason I say that is that this 12-day conflict is not the end of anything. We've been down this road before. World War I did not really resolve anything. So you ended up with what people subsequently called a 20-year truce. And then the Second World War broke out, which was an extension of the first. Desert Storm ended in 1991 inconclusively because there was no willingness to either annihilate the Republican Guard Corps, which was largely allowed to escape, or to march on Baghdad and demand the replacement of Saddam Hussein. So we're in a similar situation now. The last 12 days did not resolve anything. If anything, it demonstrated that Iran's missile arsenal, as pointed out by Ben-Gvir in Israel, was far greater than anybody appreciated and far more accurate and devastating. And all you have to do is look at the map of targets that Larry Johnson published on his site. It's very clear that Israel is in a lot of trouble. And now we've had several people that have given us information suggesting that it was Israel that called President Trump and said, we need a pause. Can you help us with a ceasefire? It was certainly not Iran, and no one should be surprised by that. After all, Iran's a nation of 92 million. That's the size of Western Europe. So why would they be desperate at this point for a ceasefire? So I think we just don't know where we go from here, but I don't think it's anywhere good because the American people are not focused. And this is something most Europeans don't understand. Americans are not focused on foreign policy. They never have been, really. If you had put anything to a vote, Americans would not have fought in any of the wars beyond our borders. In fact, the only war that anybody was really excited about was the Mexican War in 1846, 47, 48. That's it. We weren't even very happy about the Civil War. The reason the Civil War lasted as long as it did was because the North didn't want to mobilize. People didn't want to fight the war. We didn't want to fight in World War I. Didn't want to fight in World War II. We were hoodwinked into these wars by presidents who were determined to drag us in. We went in, we fought, and as soon as they were over, we did everything we could to come home. And when the Cold War ended, we decided that's enough, and virtually everybody said, let's collect our military dividend. In other words, an end to this massive spending, come home and focus in the United States. And again, we developed arguments to go around that, to keep us engaged, on the assumption that keeping America engaged overseas was not necessarily important to us, but it was so important to the rest of the world that we be everywhere. And so we've been dealing with these various lobbies that have taken the position the world will not be safe until the United States occupies most of it. Well, that's insanity. But here we are with a different version of it. This time it's entirely Israel-focused, and it's designed to essentially establish this hegemony in the region, get control of all the oil resources. That's what the banks in the city of London and New York City want. That's what the billionaire oligarchs want. This morning I was listening to, I think it's Alex Kina, and he mentioned what he called the money-lending oligarchs. I had not heard that one before, but that works just as well as billionaire oligarchs. But I think it's probably more descriptive of just who is behind everything. And then I listened to Oliver Stone, who was speaking, was talking about much the same thing. And this will continue until Americans are somehow or another involved and killed, to be blunt. As long as Americans aren't being killed, other people can die, other people can suffer. But until you kill Americans, nobody here in the United States pays a great deal of attention. And I think that's what people in the White House and on the Hill know. However, there's a huge problem, and that is that we are on very shaky financial ground. And you had the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Diesen, worried about the bond market. You had Jerome Powell under pressure to cut interest rates from the president. And you have a general feeling in the United States of unease. How can we spend on the scale that we're spending anymore when most people know instinctively you can't do that? But there is no will, no resolve to cut spending, no courage. And if you can't cut spending, you can't reduce your debt indebtedness. You can't reduce the so-called deficit, but you can't even make a dent in the sovereign national debt. So all of these things are somehow or another converging. I don't know what happens, but I don't think it's anything good.
While missiles fall and tensions escalate, a quieter war brews on Iran's northern border. Azerbaijan, backed by Israel and increasingly aligned with NATO interests, has become a launch pad for regional disruption. Intelligence agencies CIA, MI6, and Mossad are deeply involved, aiming to fracture Iran's ties with Russia and ultimately destabilize Tehran. The plan echoes the West's Ukraine playbook against Russia: isolate, infiltrate, and divide, with Azerbaijan eyeing Iranian territory under the banner of Greater Azerbaijan. The risk of a wider regional war rises. Iran, however, remains defiant, its military more unified than ever. The stakes are escalating, and the pressure is mounting. As geopolitical tensions flare, the economic foundations of the US are showing cracks. Massive spending, an overstretched military, and ballooning debt have weakened the dollar's role as a global reserve. Treasury Secretary and Fed officials are signaling alarm, even as the political class resists fiscal discipline. Meanwhile, gold is quietly reclaiming its role as a safe haven. as even mainstream economists begin questioning the dollar's longevity. This crisis isn't just financial, it's systemic. The merger of war policy and economic desperation is leading the U.S. down a volatile path. And as history warns, empires tend to overreach just before they unravel.
Listened recently to someone who insisted that the yen and the pound and the euro would all go down before the dollar does. I don't know what the rationale for that is, but that was what many people are saying. In other words, we're the healthiest horse in the glue factory. I think that's what people call us. I think it's misleading. It's delusional. And I think you're right. I think the dollar is in a lot of trouble. It's no longer seen as a real store of value. In fact, I think it was Nassim Taleb who said today gold is effectively the reserve currency. No one knows about the timing, that there are many, many factors that will influence the timing. If things were to remain constant overall, then I would say it would be 90 to 120 days before you would see a resumption, because it will take that long to restore Israel's missile arsenal. It would take that long for us to refit and rebuild our arsenal. Remember, we fired hundreds of missiles from offshore destroyers, Aegis-class destroyers, to try and help protect Israel. However, we're beginning to see something else happen in the region, and this is not necessarily brand new, but I think it's important that we understand that the CIA, MI6, Mossad, working closely together as they did in Syria, are also working in places like Egypt as well as in Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, and they're trying to isolate, to the extent that they are able, Iran from Russia. Now, they know they can't completely isolate Iran from China, although that may be possible in the future, but they definitely want to break that tie to Russia. Russia is a lifeline for Iran, and frankly, Iran is kind of a lifeline for Russia. Remember, Iran is the soft underbelly of Central Asia and the Caucasus that Russia depends upon for stability. And the worst thing that could happen would be for Iran to somehow or another disintegrate. Yet that's exactly what the CIA, MI6, and Mossad want to do. That's what they've been trying to do inside Iran by operating there and assassinating people. They've been trying to cause Iran internally to collapse. Now, that failed miserably. And if anything, I would argue that the last 12-day conflict has probably strengthened the Iranian regime more so than anything else. In fact, I was listening to several people who are experts on Iran. I am not. Essentially make that argument and also point to the fact that the Iranian military, which has taken a backseat to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is now very much involved and very much in the forefront of defending the country. That's very important because if you can bring down a state, if you can somehow or another separate it from its army, especially, that's not happened. So I think we have to look at some recent developments. The Azerbaijan has an interest in gaining at least parts or portions of Armenia. It may at some point want to capture all of it. There's no love lost between the Turks and the Armenians, as we all know, and the Azeri Turks and Azerbaijan are no exception. What's interesting about Azerbaijan is its close alliance, for all intents and purposes, with Israel. Azerbaijan provided a platform for the Mossad and the Israeli armed forces to attack Iran. They are now turning into what is increasingly a state that is hostile to Moscow. And their ambassador in Moscow has been talking to the Russian authorities about some actions they've taken recently. I think the Russians are now cognizant of what's happening, and they're very concerned about it. The next step is, of course, for the Azeri army in Azerbaijan to move into northern Iran. Like Israel that wants a greater Israel, Azerbaijan wants a greater Azerbaijan. That means it's the most logical route for expansion is into northern Iran, where you have a very large Azeri population, maybe 25% or more of the population of Iran. Now, these Azeris are Shia, as opposed to Sunni, and you have a Sunni-Shia mix in Azerbaijan. They do still speak their language, but they have been a very important component of Persian civilization and of the Iranian state. But there have always been voices advocating for some sort of greater Turkish power in northern Iran. We'll see what happens, but I think the aim now on the Azerbaijan side is to move towards Tabriz, which is the center of gravity for the Azeri Turks. And this, of course, is music to the ears of Washington and in Israel, because this would contribute to their dream, which is to divide and conquer Iran. Now, whether or not that's possible, I can't judge, but I don't think we should underestimate the impact. It will certainly weaken Iran if this happens. It will divert Iranian resources. It will distract them from other things, which is ultimately a partially positive goal. If it contributes to the breakup of Iran, so much the better. And I think what we're seeing is the kind of strategy applied to Iran that has been applied to Russia. Ukraine was utilized, much as now there's a desire to use Azerbaijan against Iran to somehow or another break up Russia, to remove the government, then move into, and of course this is very important to the financial interests in London and New York City, to move in and strip Russia of its resources, its capacity, divide it up into smaller states, and then effectively rule it. That's failed. That gambit is over. But the gambit now is just beginning with Azerbaijan and Iran. At the same time, remember, if you look at this greater Israel map, and a lot of people look at it and say, well, this is fanciful. This could not possibly happen. There are only a few million Jews. Well, you have another problem, and that is the United States and its armed forces. And you have a general in CENTCOM who is reportedly, in the news at least, closer to Mr. Netanyahu than he is to President Trump. And in fact, the White House tends to turn directly to CENTCOM for its quote-unquote intelligence, which means that they're getting the Israeli perspective and slant. Now, that may not be a big issue because you've got a chairman of the Joint Chiefs who is the senior military advisor to President Trump, who is also a very powerful, strong advocate for Israeli interests. When he was retired, he was on the board of a hedge fund that was run by Jared Kushner's brother. So as you begin to look at the ties and the people that are involved in all of this, there's an opportunity here for the U.S. Armed Forces to become involved on the ground as well as in the air and at sea directly with the Israelis. And that then takes you to Egypt, because one of the goals the Israelis have had for a very long time is to recapture the Sinai and ultimately control the Suez Canal. I mean, there's something there worth having, and it's something they think they deserve. In 1956, they moved very rapidly through Sinai towards the Suez Canal with the French and the British in the hopes of securing control of it. It didn't work. Eisenhower said, get the hell out, and ended it. Today, that's not going to happen. Today, if anything, we will back it. Now, what the level of joint planning is, what the level of joint discussions happens to be, I have no idea. These are just things floating in the ether around Washington, D.C., and down in Florida around U.S. Central Command headquarters, and as always around Langley. So we'll have to see. But it doesn't look good, and it certainly bodes ill for any short war. The question is then not if we're going to see more war and see more American involvement, but when.